Samuel Carter's world was wide and quiet. A vast Wyoming ranch carved from wind and willpower. The grasslands stretching out so far, they seemed to roll right into the clouds. At 69, Samuel was as much a part of the land as the old cottonwoods standing sentry along the creek bed. The house, weathered clapboard and stone, hunched against the endless prairie winds, stood alone, stubbornly clinging to the edge of civilization. Out here, time felt slower, measured by the steady rhythm of chores and the hush that descended each evening after sunset. Each morning, Samuel rose before the light. He moved through his daily routine with the tired efficiency of a man who'd done the same things 1,000 times. Coffee percolated on the stove, thick and black, while he watched dawn seep across the land, painting the fields in bruised lavender and gold. He'd step out onto the porch, draw a long breath, and listen. Not for anything in particular, just the hush, the song of meadowlarks, the whisper of grass shifting under a faint breeze. It was a landscape made for silence and secrets. Samuel's grief for his late wife, Marion, was something like the wind, always there, sometimes harsh and biting, sometimes just a chill in the air that reminded him of what he'd lost. Her laughter used to fill the house, brightening the darkest days. Now, it was only the echo of her presence, caught in the faded quilt draped across the bed, or the porcelain teacup she'd insisted on keeping, despite its chip. He still talked to her sometimes, in the privacy of his thoughts, asking what she'd make for supper or whether the rain would hold. But the only reply was the soft creak of the house settling and the far-off cry of coyotes. The animals were his only company now, a pair of lazy barn cats, a flock of indifferent chickens, and the 2 old quarter horses that grazed in the north pasture. He fed them every morning, careful to keep the routine precise, as if this order might hold chaos at bay. The cats wove around his boots, mewling for scraps, while the horses flicked their ears and nickered, grateful for hay and gentle words. Samuel moved slowly, joints aching, but he took pride in doing every task himself, refusing help from neighbors or the occasional well-meaning stranger. Sometimes he rode the fence line, scanning for breaks or signs of trespassers. The work was lonely and endless. The only excitement came from weather, blizzards in winter, lightning storms that cracked the sky open in summer. In the evenings, after supper, he'd sit on the porch with a battered radio, letting old country music drift over the land as the sun bled out behind the distant hills. It was peaceful, but the peace came with a price. The ache of solitude, the weight of days blurring together. One particular afternoon, Samuel lingered at the edge of his property, watching a herd of pronghorns leap the wire fence with effortless grace. It struck him that he was the only human for miles, an island in an ocean of grass. The isolation was sometimes a comfort, other times a wound that never quite healed. He found himself talking to the wind, sharing fragments of memory, old stories that nobody else was left to hear. He remembered the days when the ranch was alive with people. Marion's homemade pies cooling on the window ledge, laughter spilling from the kitchen, friends stopping by with gossip and news. Now, the mailbox stayed empty for weeks at a time. The world had shrunk down to what Samuel could see from his porch, and sometimes, in the deep of night, he wondered if he'd vanished from it altogether. But there was a strange comfort in the routine, in the certainty that the sun would rise, the grass would grow, and the seasons would turn. Samuel had come to accept that the land asked for everything and gave little back, except a quiet beauty and a chance to remember those who'd gone before. He found himself holding on to small rituals, sharpening his old pocket knife, oiling the saddle Marion had used, polishing her wedding ring with a scrap of flannel. Each act was a prayer, a way to keep her close, to stave off the emptiness that sometimes threatened to swallow him whole. As autumn crept in, the nights grew colder and the wind sharpened. Samuel began to feel a new unease in his bones, a sense that change was coming. The animals grew restless, skittish at odd sounds in the night. Coyotes called from the hills, closer than before. The grass rippled in uneasy waves. Something about the silence felt charged, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for a story to begin. And in the deepest hours before dawn, Samuel sometimes dreamed of wild horses running across the plains, manes streaming, hooves thundering, eyes wild and bright. He'd wake with the ghost of those dreams lingering, heart pounding, listening to the wind for a sign that he was not as alone as he thought. Out there, on the lonesome plains, anything still felt possible. And on the horizon, the first hint of change was stirring, unseen, unstoppable, and destined to shatter the silence Samuel had carried for so long. The wind had been howling since midnight, rattling windows and carrying the sharp scent of oncoming rain. Samuel Carter awoke to a sky the color of bruised steel, the air thick with the promise of a storm. He dressed in layers, flannel shirt, wool vest, battered hat, and trudged outside, boots sinking into mud from the previous day's showers. As he crossed the yard, thunder rolled far off, making the chickens flutter in their coop and the horses bunch together near the fence. Samuel's mind was already on the morning chores, but something unusual caught his eye at the edge of his property, where the grass grew tall and wild near the stand of willows. There, barely visible through the curtain of rain, was a dark shape, motionless and out of place. He squinted, heart thumping with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Out here you learn to respect anything unexpected: stray livestock, wounded wildlife, even the occasional trespasser trying to cut across the plains. He grabbed his old field glasses from the porch, peering through the streaked lenses. As the wind parted the grass, Samuel saw what it was: a horse, collapsed on its side, ribs stark beneath a coat streaked with mud and blood. Its legs were folded awkwardly, and every rise and fall of its chest seemed like a battle. Despite the obvious suffering, the animal's eyes were open and wild, reflecting a stubborn glint of life that made Samuel's chest tighten. He hesitated, memory flooding back, colts born in the spring, Marion's gentle hands bandaging wounds, the bitter ache of every animal lost over the years. Instinct warned him to be careful. Wild horses could kick or bite if frightened, and this one looked desperate. But Samuel's compassion, honed by years of hardship and loneliness, refused to let him turn away. He approached slowly, speaking in a low, steady voice that he hoped would soothe. The horse made no move to rise, only rolled its eyes to track his movements. As Samuel drew closer, he could see the animal was young, maybe 6 or 7 years old, a Mustang unmistakable even through the mud and grime. Its coat, beneath the filth, was a deep chestnut, marred by fresh wounds and old scars. Blood trickled from a deep cut on its flank, staining the grass beneath. A sudden gust of wind rattled the willows and made the Mustang flinch. Samuel crouched, hands open, showing he meant no harm. For a long moment, the horse simply lay there, sides heaving, nostrils flaring with fear. Samuel knew that the odds were not good. Out here, injured wild animals rarely survived. But something about this Mustang, its fierce gaze, the way it refused to give in, reminded Samuel of himself. The rain intensified, pelting them both, cold and insistent. Samuel's clothes clung to his skin as he studied the wounds. A gash on the chest, deep rope burns around the legs, bruises along the ribs. It was clear this horse hadn't just been injured in a fall or a fight. There was a story here, one written in pain and endurance. Determined, Samuel made a quick decision. He fetched a rope, but not to restrain, just to guide if possible. He returned with a bucket of water and a few carrots, offering them with a shaky hand. The Mustang sniffed the air, wary but clearly thirsty. It took a hesitant sip, then another, before exhaustion overcame it, and its head dropped to the wet grass again. The wind carried distant thunder as Samuel tried to figure out how to help. Dragging the animal would be impossible. Coaxing it to stand seemed just as unlikely. But Samuel refused to give up. He talked softly, recalling Marion's old tricks, how she'd lure frightened animals with treats, how her patience always seemed to work miracles. He wished, not for the first time, that she was here now. At last, he managed to loop the rope loosely around the Mustang's neck, giving it space to move without feeling trapped. He patted the animal's neck, feeling its tremors under his hand. The Mustang, Valor, the name just arrived in Samuel's mind, born from the stubborn set of the horse's jaw, watched him with wary resignation. With great care, Samuel positioned himself at the animal's shoulder and pressed gently, encouraging Valor to try. The first attempt was hopeless. Valor's legs scrabbled weakly in the mud before he collapsed again, eyes squeezed shut in pain. Samuel's own muscles protested, his heart hammering with worry and exertion. He tried again, his voice low, offering encouragement. This time, Valor managed to heave himself upright, standing on trembling legs, sides lathered with sweat and rain. Samuel didn't waste a second. Slowly, step by faltering step, he led Valor across the sodden field, every inch a battle. The horse stumbled, nearly going down more than once, but Samuel steadied him, whispering nonsense just to fill the air. By the time they reached the barn, both man and animal were drenched, mud-caked, and exhausted. Inside, the barn smelled of hay and leather, a small pocket of warmth in the storm. Samuel closed the doors against the rising wind, made a rough bed of straw, and eased Valor down. The Mustang shivered, eyes wide and wild, but didn't try to bolt. Samuel fetched his old veterinary kit, hands shaking as he cleaned wounds, staunched bleeding, and did what little he could with the supplies he had left. As dusk fell and the storm raged outside, Samuel sat with Valor, watching the horse's chest rise and fall. The sense of isolation he'd carried for so long was momentarily replaced by something fierce and urgent, a need to help, to rescue, to save what could still be saved. In that battered barn, two survivors faced the night together, bound by shared hardship and an unspoken promise that neither would give up without a fight. Night pressed down on the ranch with the weight of 1,000 memories. The storm that had battered the land for hours finally drifted east, leaving behind the hush of sodden earth and the faint, metallic smell of rain. Samuel Carter stood over the battered Mustang, Valor, whose ragged breathing filled the barn shadows with tension. Every muscle in Samuel's aging body ached from the ordeal of dragging and coaxing the wild horse to shelter. But he moved with the silent determination of a man who'd spent his whole life fighting to keep hope alive. The barn's lantern cast a dim glow, flickering against the wooden walls, throwing strange shapes across the straw. Samuel's hands worked by memory, cleaning wounds with what little iodine he could find, pulling out bits of gravel from Valor's cut flank. He felt the horse's trembling muscles and thought of Marion, her voice whispering in his mind, steady and calm, reminding him to be gentle. She had always believed that kindness was stronger than any rope or rein. Samuel clung to that belief now as if it were a lifeline. Valor shifted restlessly, eyes rolling white, sides heaving from pain and fear. Samuel murmured, voice steady and low, more for himself than for the animal, filling the barn with soft, meaningless syllables. The words floated on the air, mixing with the warm scent of hay, the sharp tang of medicine, and the cold breath of the departing storm. At times, Samuel wondered if he was talking to the horse, or to the emptiness that had settled in his soul since Marion's passing. Maybe it didn't matter. They were both survivors, thrown together by circumstance and battered by the same relentless wind. The old rancher's thoughts slipped backward into the past. He remembered the days when he and Marion worked side by side, breaking wild colts in the spring, nursing sick calves in the dead of winter. Back then, the barn was alive with noise and laughter. The clang of buckets and the soft hum of songs Marion used to sing while she worked. Now there was only the creak of beams, the rustle of mice in the feed sacks, and the quiet, stubborn heartbeat of a man who refused to surrender. Samuel's body reminded him, with every movement, just how many years had passed since those days. His shoulders ached from lifting Valor's limp weight. His knees twinged each time he knelt in the straw, and his fingers felt stiff and clumsy as he tended the horse's wounds. But he pushed through the pain, driven by something deeper, a need to save this creature, to find meaning in a world that sometimes felt empty and cruel. Outside, the wind had died. The prairie was silent except for the faint calls of nightbirds and the distant yip of coyotes hunting along the creek. Samuel glanced at the barn doors, half expecting the shadows to shift, to reveal another wild creature or some remnant of the past come to haunt him. But the only movement was the slow rise and fall of Valor's chest, the uncertain flick of his ears. As midnight crept in, Samuel tried to recall the tricks he'd learned over a lifetime. He boiled water on the old camping stove he kept in the tack room, mixing in a little molasses and oats, coaxing Valor to take a few weak sips. He rigged an old blanket over the horse's back, trying to ward off the chill. He checked the wounds again, wrapping them as best he could, all the while muttering the quiet prayers of a man who'd lost more than he cared to count. Sometimes, Samuel's mind drifted to darker places. He thought about loss, the sharpness of it, the way it could hollow a man out. He thought about the morning he'd found Marion gone, the house impossibly quiet, the sun rising as if nothing in the world had changed. The ache of that moment echoed now in the barn, mingling with the fear that he might fail again, that Valor might slip away despite his best efforts. But as the hours passed, Samuel noticed small changes. Valor's breathing grew steadier. The wildness in his eyes dimmed just enough to let trust flicker in the shadows. When Samuel held out a handful of grain, the horse nuzzled it, weak but willing, his lips brushing Samuel's palm with surprising gentleness. For the first time in a long while, Samuel felt a surge of hope, fragile, uncertain, but real. He sat beside the horse, back against the barn wall, exhaustion pulling him down. The night seemed endless, but Samuel watched Valor with a quiet sense of pride. Against the odds, they'd made it through one more day. Outside, the first fingers of dawn crept across the plains, painting the world in soft grays and silvers. In that uncertain light, Everything seemed possible again. Samuel let himself drift, half asleep. The warmth of the barn and the steady presence of the Mustang beside him, keeping the loneliness at bay. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears. But for now, in the hush between night and morning, Samuel Carter allowed himself to believe that survival was its own kind of victory, that sometimes saving a life, even a wild one, was the most important thing a man could do. Morning seeped into the barn through cracks in the old wooden slats, strips of pale light stretching across the packed earth floor. Samuel Carter's bones ached from a night spent half sleeping in the hay, always aware of Valor's presence beside him. The storm had passed, leaving the air cold and damp. Samuel sat up slowly, shoulders stiff, and looked over at the Mustang. Valor lay quietly in the straw, breath steady but shallow, ears flicking at the slightest sound. For the first time, there was no panic in the horse's eyes, only a deep exhaustion and a tentative curiosity that made Samuel's heart soften. As Samuel moved closer, the early sunlight revealed more than just mud and dried blood on Valor's coat. Running his hand gently along the horse's side, he felt the ridges of old scars beneath his fingers, some healed poorly, others raw and fresh. Rope burns ringed Valor's legs, ugly welts where flesh had been rubbed raw by desperate, prolonged struggle. Along his flank, thin lines crossed over each other, evidence of whippings or wire. Samuel felt a surge of anger, an emotion he rarely allowed himself. He'd seen cruelty in many forms out here on the plains, but to break a creature's spirit through pain seemed a betrayal of everything he'd learned about animals and men. He worked slowly, washing away dried blood and caked mud. Valor shuddered whenever Samuel's hands touched the worst wounds, but never tried to bolt. The horse's trust was brittle, earned by Samuel's patience and gentle voice in the long night hours. As he tended the injuries, Samuel recalled stories Marion used to tell about wild horses, how they survived things that would break lesser animals, how their spirits were forged by wind and hardship. Valor was proof of that resilience, even if it was buried under layers of pain. For Samuel, nursing Valor became more than a chore. Each wound cleaned, each bandage applied, brought a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The ranch had felt empty since Marion's passing, the routines hollow and endless. But here, in the soft morning hush, the fight to save Valor gave Samuel something to hold on to. He spoke softly, telling the horse stories of the land, of storms weathered and seasons changed, his words weaving through the barn's dust and hay like old prayers. As the day wore on, small victories broke up the steady rhythm of care. When Samuel returned with a bucket of water, Valor struggled to his knees, then stood, though his legs shook with effort. The Mustang eyed Samuel warily, nostrils flaring, but took a slow, careful drink from the bucket placed within reach. Samuel watched every swallow, hope rising with each mouthful. Later, he offered an apple, cut into quarters. Valor sniffed it, lips twitching uncertainly, before taking a tentative bite. Samuel grinned, the first real smile in what felt like years. Despite the progress, signs of abuse haunted every step. At one point, Samuel found an old, rusted shoe embedded in Valor's hoof, a clear mark of rough handling. Removing it took patience, gentle coaxing, and the steady reassurance that came only from experience. All the while, Samuel's anger simmered, fueling his resolve. No animal deserved this, least of all a creature as proud and wild as Valor. As night approached, the barn became a sanctuary against the chill settling over the plains. Samuel checked the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. He didn't trust the world to leave them alone, not with a horse like Valor, whose suffering hinted at a story that wasn't finished yet. The Mustang rested easier, now able to rise and stand without collapsing. When Samuel brushed Valor's mane, the horse leaned into the touch, the first sign of affection he'd shown. Outside, the sky blazed orange and purple. Samuel stood at the barn door, watching the last light fade, and felt a shift inside him. The ache of loneliness had not vanished, but it was joined by something new, a sense of responsibility, of purpose, of shared survival. The world was still harsh, the future uncertain, but tonight Samuel believed they could face it together. He returned to Valor, settling down in the straw for another long vigil. The Mustang slept, finally, body curled against the cold, breath deep and even. Samuel reached out and rested his hand on Valor's neck, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath scarred skin. For the first time since Marion's death, Samuel allowed himself to hope that healing was possible, for both man and horse. In the barn's hush, surrounded by the smell of hay and the warmth of another living soul, Samuel Carter found the courage to keep going, fueled by anger at cruelty, but guided by the slow, steady return of trust. The days that followed were a blur of cautious optimism. Valor grew stronger beneath Samuel's watchful eye, taking more food each day, wounds beginning to knit together beneath clean bandages. The barn became a place of quiet purpose, the rhythms of care slowly filling the void that grief had left behind. Each sunrise brought a new test of patience, Valor flinching at sudden movement, eyes dark with memories of pain, but always returning to Samuel's gentle presence. Trust, Samuel realized, was built one small moment at a time. But peace out on the plains never lasted long. It was a cold morning, the air sharp with the scent of approaching winter. Samuel was gathering fresh hay from the loft when he heard the distant crunch of tires on gravel, a sound that didn't belong to any neighbor. He paused, heart tightening, listening to the subtle shift in the wind as a truck and horse trailer appeared on the horizon. They drove fast, raising a tail of dust that sparkled in the weak sunlight. Samuel wiped his hands on his jeans, a familiar anxiety prickling at the base of his neck. The vehicles rolled to a stop at the end of the drive, two men in crisp shirts jumping down, scanning the property with predatory eyes. Behind them, a tall woman stepped out, a figure Samuel recognized from local gossip and rare town meetings. Abigail Foster, owner of one of the largest spreads in the county, was known for her sharp tongue and harder heart. She moved with practiced authority, her boots striking the dirt like hammer blows. Eyes already fixed on the barn, as if she could see straight through its walls. Samuel's instinct was to shield Valor, to block the barn with his own body if he had to. He stepped outside, forcing himself to appear calm, but the look on Abigail's face told him this wasn't a social visit. She didn't bother with pleasantries. Her gaze swept over the yard, landing on the faint tracks Samuel hadn't had time to hide. Without preamble, she announced her claim. The wild Mustang Samuel had taken in was hers, lost weeks before during a roundup gone wrong. The men with her, hands broad and cold-eyed, spread out to circle the barn. Samuel listened, every word stoking a slow, controlled fury inside him. He saw in Abigail's sharp features the same hunger for control that had left Valor's body marked by scars and rope burns. She spoke of property and losses, money and legal rights. Her tone clipped and absolute. Samuel stood his ground, jaw set, hands curled tight at his sides. Abigail revealed her intent with chilling clarity. Valor, she said, had always been trouble. Too wild, too stubborn, a waste of her time and resources. She recounted attempts to break him, endless rounds of roping, harsh bits, days without water. The horse, she claimed, was fit only for slaughter now. There was profit to be made, even from ruined animals. Samuel's pulse hammered in his ears, outrage burning away the last vestiges of caution. Refusing to surrender valor was no simple act of defiance. Samuel knew the law in these parts was often written by whoever owned the most land, and Abigail owned nearly everything between the river and the mountain. But looking at her, Samuel saw only the ugliness of power misused, the memory of valor's terror, the scars beneath his coat, the slow, painful steps toward trust. These things bound Samuel to the horse in a way that no legal threat could break. Tension crackled in the air as Abigail's men drifted closer to the barn, ready to take what they believed was theirs. Samuel spoke, words quiet but unwavering, making it clear he would not hand over the Mustang. The men hesitated, unsure. The moment stretched, brittle as ice. Abigail's eyes narrowed, promising consequences Samuel could not afford to ignore. The confrontation left the air thick with threat. Abigail gave him until sunset to reconsider, promising she'd return, with the sheriff if necessary. The truck roared away, leaving deep ruts in the drive and a chill that lingered long after the dust had settled. Inside the barn, Samuel found Valor trembling, nostrils wide, sensing danger on the wind. Samuel ran a reassuring hand along the horse's neck, whispering comfort. He knew this stand would not end quietly. Abigail Foster would not let her will be defied. The thought of Valor returned to that cruelty was unbearable. As he listened to the echo of Abigail's threats, Samuel felt something inside him harden into resolve. The rest of the day passed in a haze of preparation. Samuel checked locks, reinforced the barn door, hid the trailer beneath a tarp, and packed emergency supplies just in case. Valor watched every move, his trust now mingled with fear. As the sun dipped low, painting the plains in bands of red and gold, Samuel understood what had to be done. Protecting Valor was no longer just an act of kindness. It was a fight against everything cruel and small in the world. Darkness crept over the ranch, bringing silence, uncertainty, and a new, defiant hope. Samuel sat by Valor's stall long into the night, watching the horse doze beneath a blanket of shadows, already planning for the battle ahead. Samuel Carter moved through the house in silence, mind racing beneath his calm exterior. Abigail Foster's visit still echoed in his thoughts, her sharp words leaving an aftertaste of fear and outrage. The threat was real now, a force as cold and relentless as the Wyoming wind. He knew Abigail wouldn't wait long before returning, and when she did, she'd bring the law with her or bend it to her will. The old world Samuel had spent his life defending, the world of handshake agreements and neighborly trust, felt suddenly very far away. The hours after Abigail's departure stretched thin and tense. Samuel sat at his worn kitchen table, the surface scarred by years of use, and stared at the battered landline phone that rarely rang these days. The house felt emptier than usual, the walls pressing in. He sipped his coffee, feeling the familiar ache in his chest, then reached for the phone with a trembling hand and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. Henry Miller's voice was rough with sleep, but it carried a warmth that softened Samuel's fear. Henry had been a horseman all his life, one of the best trainers in the West, before retiring to a cabin a few counties over. There'd been long years when the two men had drifted apart, life and loss pushing them to different corners of the world. But some bonds, Samuel knew, were forged by fire and never truly broke. He explained everything: Valor's battered state, the cruelty revealed in scars and fear, Abigail's threats, and his own growing sense of purpose. Henry listened without interruption, then promised to come by first light, bringing with him the knowledge and grit that had once made them a formidable pair. Samuel hung up and breathed easier, but the gravity of what he planned began to settle in his bones. He paced the length of his kitchen, then moved outside to the barn where Valor stood restless in his stall, picking at leftover hay. Samuel checked the locks again, ran his hands over the boards, and made sure the old horse trailer was still hidden beneath the tarp and brush at the back of the property. He gathered what supplies he could find: bandages, feed, extra water, even Marion's old saddle blanket. Each item packed was a promise. He would not let Valor return to cruelty, no matter the risk. Night fell hard, a blanket of deep blue pierced by wind and the lonely call of coyotes. Samuel sat in the barn with Valor, watching the horse's eyes flicker with nervous energy. The quiet of the night brought memories: Marion's voice, the bright chaos of days when the ranch was alive, laughter echoing from kitchen to field. He missed her wisdom most of all now, her calm way of seeing the world, the belief that good people could always find a way through. Samuel drew on that memory like a talisman, letting it shape his courage. As midnight approached, headlights swept across the distant hills. Samuel tensed, heart pounding, before realizing it was only Henry, arriving early in an old pickup, headlights dimmed out of habit. He parked far from the house and made his way to the barn, the years showing in his stride but not slowing his determination. The two men embraced in a wordless greeting, then got to work, discussing the plan in hushed tones, careful to keep their voices low. The idea was simple in theory, but dangerous in execution. They would move Valor under cover of darkness, driving him north along back roads and across the state line to a sanctuary where Abigail's reach would end. Samuel had called ahead. An old acquaintance ran the place, a haven for horses too wild or broken for most ranchers. There, Valor would have the chance at freedom he'd almost lost forever. Tension grew as they prepared, every shadow outside the barn a potential threat. Henry checked the trailer for weak spots, shoring up the door and laying fresh straw inside. Samuel slipped a halter over Valor's head, whispering reassurances, steadying the horse as best he could. Valor sensed the urgency, nostrils flaring, hooves restless on the straw. The men worked in near silence, every movement purposeful. A bitter wind swept through the barn, rattling loose shingles and carrying the faint scent of snow. Time felt slippery, measured only in nervous glances and the sound of Valor's breathing. Samuel tried to ignore the voice in his head, listing everything that could go wrong. The trailer breaking down, Abigail blocking the road, the sheriff siding with the powerful instead of the right. He had lived long enough to know how easily hope could unravel. But every time he looked at Valor, saw the scars and the trust shining behind the horse's fear, Samuel's resolve strengthened. He was not just fighting for an animal. He was fighting for the small, hard-won bits of goodness left in the world, for Marion's memory, for the man he still wanted to be. By the time the first stars began to fade and the sky grew gray at the edges, they were ready. Samuel squeezed Henry's shoulder in silent thanks, then turned to Valor, heart pounding. There was no going back now. Every step they took from here would be in defiance of the darkness that threatened to swallow them all. The old ranch, silent and battered by wind, seemed to hold its breath as Samuel and Henry loaded Valor into the trailer and prepared to vanish into the uncertain dawn. Darkness had settled deep and heavy over the plains by the time Samuel and Henry finished their final checks. Every sound seemed amplified, the scuff of boots in the gravel, the wind whispering warnings through brittle grass, the distant thunder of hooves from wild herds somewhere out in the unseen miles. The old barn doors creaked open just wide enough to slip Valor out into the ink-black night, Henry leading, Samuel walking at the horse's flank, a steadying hand on his shoulder. They moved quickly, almost without words, every action deliberate and loaded with the knowledge that Abigail Foster's threat was not an empty one. Samuel's heartbeat thudded in his chest, matching the rhythm of Valor's hesitant steps. The horse's eyes rolled, nostrils flaring at every unfamiliar scent, diesel fumes from Henry's truck, the sharp tang of oiled metal, the cold iron scent of the trailer that would carry him away from the only world he'd ever known. Loading Valor was an exercise in patience and trust. The Mustang balked at the ramp, hooves scraping on wood, panic threatening to undo all the fragile progress they had made. Samuel murmured encouragement, his voice little more than a vibration in the dark. Henry held a bucket of oats, drawing Valor forward one trembling step at a time. For a long moment, it seemed the plan might fail. Valor's muscles locked with fear, the wind gusting cold and sharp enough to sting Samuel's eyes. But the bond they'd forged through shared hardship proved strong enough. With a final, quivering breath, Valor climbed into the trailer, head low, flanks twitching with nerves. Samuel closed the trailer door with a soft click, his hands shaking only a little. They worked quickly now, securing latches, checking tires, stowing supplies, each motion practiced but urgent. Henry's old truck rumbled to life. Headlights kept off as they pulled away from the barn, following a route that skirted the main road and disappeared into the vast, shadowed landscape. The journey north began in silence, broken only by the drone of the engine and the occasional clatter from the trailer, as Valor shifted his weight. Samuel rode shotgun, his eyes fixed on the world outside. Fields rimmed with frost, trees etched in silver by the moonlight, the endless sweep of prairie rolling away in every direction. In the darkness, everything felt stretched and uncertain, as if time itself might lose its grip and send them spinning into the unknown. The back roads were muddy from the recent storm, each rut and puddle threatening to bog the truck down or jostle the trailer. Henry's hands were steady on the wheel, jaw set with concentration. Samuel braced himself as they crept along the narrow tracks, every bump sending a fresh wave of anxiety through him. Behind them, the barn and house shrank into memory, their familiar outlines swallowed by night. With each mile, Samuel's mind raced through a catalog of what-ifs. What if Abigail had already called the sheriff, or set her men to watch the crossroads? What if Valor panicked and injured himself in the trailer? What if the sanctuary turned them away, unwilling to risk trouble with someone as powerful as Abigail Foster? He pressed these fears down, focusing on the present, the smell of dust and diesel, the cold air seeping through the window, the soft rhythm of Henry's breathing. At one point, a pair of headlights flashed on a distant road, far off but closing fast. Henry pulled off onto a narrow track, killing the engine and lights, and they sat in tense silence as the vehicle roared past. A ranch truck, not law enforcement, but a reminder of how thin the line between safety and disaster had become. Samuel gripped the dash, feeling the weight of his choices, the enormity of what they were risking. Not just his own freedom, but Valor's life, a fragile trust bound together by scarred skin and stubborn hope. The hours crept by. The wind grew sharper, hinting at snow. The truck's heater struggled against the chill. Samuel watched the sky for the first blush of dawn, counting every minute as a victory. In the back, Valor shifted, stamping a hoof in protest. Samuel slid out once to check on him, rubbing the horse's neck through the slats, whispering steady comfort. The Mustang's eyes met his, wide, uncertain, but holding the faintest glimmer of trust. Samuel clung to that, letting it guide him through the dark. With the state border finally ahead, Henry slowed to a crawl, careful of muddy ruts and ice forming on the bridge. The sanctuary was just over the rise, a cluster of weathered barns and rolling fields, lights glowing faintly against the dawn. Relief crashed through Samuel so hard he nearly wept. The journey had been a gauntlet of nerves, each mile a challenge, each moment a test of resolve and trust. They pulled into the sanctuary drive as the first hint of sunrise gilded the sky. Samuel opened the trailer, letting Valor step down onto new ground. The Mustang stood trembling, sides heaving, but alive and, at last, free from the hands that had tried to break him. The night's dangers were not yet a memory, but as light spread over the plains, Samuel allowed himself to believe they'd done something good, something brave. For the first time in years, he felt the cold lift from his heart, replaced by a fierce, exhausted hope. Exhaustion had settled over Samuel and Henry like a heavy blanket by the time they finally rolled through the gates of the sanctuary. The world outside was just waking, sky streaked with peach and lavender, birds stirring in the wind-swept grass. Samuel felt the relief deep in his bones, mingled with a sharp, bitter-sweet ache. The fight to bring Valor this far had stripped him bare, leaving behind only a sense of fragile hope and the tired certainty that he had done everything he could. The sanctuary was nothing like Abigail Foster's orderly ranch or Samuel's own aging spread. Here, horses wandered in large, fenced meadows, their coats shaggy and unbrushed, moving in loose, shifting herds. The barns were worn but sturdy, the fences patched and mended in places, and everywhere there was a quiet hum of care. A young woman met them at the gate, her clothes streaked with mud, her eyes bright with tired kindness. Samuel exchanged only a few words, just enough to explain that Valor needed time, patience, and a place to heal. She listened, nodding, taking in the wildness still alive in the Mustang's eyes. Henry guided the trailer to a stall at the back of the barn, away from the other horses, giving Valor space and quiet. The Mustang hesitated at first, nose flaring at the unfamiliar scents, fresh hay, liniment, and the deep, earthy musk of so many animals sharing the same shelter. But exhaustion overcame suspicion, and Samuel led him gently into the straw-lined stall, where he sank down, body trembling but finally at rest. Samuel busied himself with practicalities, checking the bandages, filling the water bucket, brushing out Valor's mane. Each act was a ritual, a silent farewell. There was pride in the way Valor stood a little taller now, the wounds healing beneath Samuel's hands, trust flickering behind the uncertainty in his gaze. Henry gave Samuel's shoulder a squeeze, and together they stepped out into the cool morning, the barn quiet behind them except for the rustle of hooves and the sleepy sighs of the horses settling in. Outside, Samuel felt the world shift. The burden he'd carried since Marion's death seemed lighter now. Maybe it was the clean air or the sense that, for the first time in a long while, he'd fought for something good and won. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last traces of night, and Samuel let himself hope that this would be a true new beginning. For Valor, for himself, for whatever was left of the life he'd built on the edge of the wild. He found himself wandering the sanctuary grounds, breathing in the smell of clover and wet earth. He watched as a group of children, visiting from a nearby town, approached a gentle gelding with outstretched hands, their laughter rising over the fields. There was healing here, not just for animals, but for the broken places in every heart that came through the gates. Samuel understood, in a way he never had before, the meaning of letting go, giving something wild and precious the chance to find its own way, even if it meant saying goodbye. The morning slipped by in a haze. Samuel made arrangements with the sanctuary's manager, a sturdy woman with quiet authority, confirming that Valor would be given time to heal and roam as he pleased. There were papers to sign, details to share, and always the underlying worry that Abigail Foster might still try to interfere. But for the moment, the Mustang was safe, beyond the reach of greed and cruelty. Feeling a quiet satisfaction, Samuel returned to the barn to check on Valor one last time. The stall was empty. The halter lay in the straw. Gates swung wide on silent hinges. Panic jolted through Samuel. He searched the neighboring stalls, the feed room, even the small paddock behind the barn. There was no sign of forced entry. No hoofprints in the mud except those leading away, out into the sanctuary's wide, open fields. The staff were baffled. Gates and fences were intact. No one had seen anyone enter or leave, and the other horses remained calm, as if nothing unusual had happened. It was as if Valor had simply melted into the morning, drawn by something in the wind that only a wild heart could hear. Samuel followed the tracks as far as he could, past the edge of the grazing herds, through tall grass glistening with dew. They faded near the tree line, where sunlight flickered through trembling leaves and the world grew quiet and mysterious again. He stood there a long while, letting the ache of loss settle over him. Not the sharp, shattering kind he'd felt with Marion, but something softer, threaded with pride and gratitude. He turned back toward the sanctuary, feeling both emptier and more whole than he had in years. He had given Valor a second chance at freedom. Now, it was up to the Mustang to choose his own path. The lesson was a hard one, but Samuel understood. Love was not about holding on, but about letting go when the time was right, trusting that what was wild and true would find its way home to itself. The day grew brighter as Samuel left the barn behind, ready to face whatever came next with the quiet strength that only those who have truly let go can know. The search began before the sun was fully overhead, the light still gold and tentative as it filtered through the trembling cottonwoods. Samuel moved methodically across the sanctuary grounds, boots leaving deep impressions in the dew-laden grass. Each step carried both hope and dread. Hope that he might find some sign of Valor, dread that all he'd discover was emptiness, echoing through the fields. He followed the hoofprints as long as he could, tracking the way they curved through pasture, skirted the old split-rail fence, and vanished into the tall grass beyond the last paddock. The prints were sharp at first, pressed deep where the ground was soft, but they faded as the earth grew dry and the wind combed over the land, erasing every trace. Samuel paused, letting the world settle around him, and listened to the distant nickering of sanctuary horses and the faint hush of the breeze. There was nothing. No startled birds, no broken branches, no sign of a wild Mustang weaving through the brush. Only the vast, indifferent landscape, stretching out in every direction. The ache inside Samuel's chest was a familiar one, though he'd hoped he might not feel it again so soon. Loss, he realized, wasn't a single blow. It was a slow erosion, wearing at the heart day by day, year by year. He remembered Marion's passing, how the house had seemed to echo with silence for months afterward, each object suddenly precious and unbearable all at once. Now, standing beneath the open sky, he felt that old pain shift and settle, mingling with something new, a fierce pride in what he'd done and a piercing regret that he couldn't do more. He returned to the barn, searching every shadow and stall, asking staff if anyone had seen the Mustang slip away. The sanctuary manager walked the fences with him, eyes scanning the horizon for movement, but Valor had vanished as quietly as a breath. Some of the staff offered comfort, sharing stories of other wild horses who'd come and gone, choosing their own path when the world offered a door. Samuel listened, grateful but restless, unable to shake the feeling that he'd failed Valor in the end. As the afternoon wore on, he found himself drawn to the edge of the property, where the land fell away into rolling hills and sage. He remembered riding there with Marion in years past, their laughter floating on the breeze, the world wide open before them. He closed his eyes and tried to picture Valor moving through that wild country, head high, scars fading beneath new sun, hooves drumming out a rhythm older than fences and fear. It was an image that hurt and healed at the same time. Henry found him there as shadows lengthened, his old friend's face lined with concern and understanding. They stood side by side for a long while, neither needing to fill the silence. Finally, Henry spoke, soft, steady, a reminder shaped by his own years and scars. He told Samuel that wild things sometimes chose freedom, no matter the risk, and that loving them meant accepting the possibility of loss. The words fell into the quiet between them, rippling outward like stones cast into still water. Samuel nodded, knowing Henry was right, though the lesson felt as raw as any wound. He thought back on all the moments he'd shared with Valor, the first time the horse had taken food from his hand, the long, sleepless nights spent watching over him, the tentative trust that had slowly grown between them. Each memory was a reminder that connection didn't always last, but that it mattered all the same. As dusk painted the sky in streaks of violet and gold, Samuel wandered back to the sanctuary barn, pausing one last time by the empty stall. He ran his hand over the worn gate, remembering the warmth of Valor's breath, the weight of his head resting in Samuel's hands. There was no anger in his heart, only a bittersweet gratitude for the chance to have known such a creature, untamed, resilient, and fiercely alive. He slept that night beneath unfamiliar stars, dreams haunted by hoofbeats and distant calls, waking more than once with the feeling that he was not alone. In those quiet hours, Samuel came to see that letting go was not a mark of failure, but of faith, a belief that the world held more possibilities than any one man could shape or control. By morning, the ache of loss had softened into something gentler. Samuel sat with Henry over coffee, both men sharing memories, laughter, and the quiet comfort of company earned through hardship. The sanctuary's work continued around them. Horses fed, fences mended, the cycle of care unbroken even in the face of uncertainty. Samuel knew he would return to his ranch changed, carrying with him the lessons learned in pain and in hope. Valor's hoofprints might have faded from the earth, but their mark would remain on Samuel's heart, proof that compassion, once given, could never truly be lost. He looked out over the endless plains, letting the wind carry his thoughts wherever wild things ran. Somewhere out there, he imagined, a Mustang galloped beneath an open sky, unbroken, unbowed, and finally free. The journey back to his ranch was slow, each mile unfolding beneath a vast Wyoming sky streaked with the pale blues and golds of early morning. Samuel drove with the window cracked, letting the wind rush in, carrying with it the scent of sage, distant rain, and something wild and untamable. The sanctuary faded behind him, replaced by the endless sweep of plains and the lonely hum of the road. The land was unchanged, fences running like scars across the prairie, the old cottonwoods bowing before the wind, the sun climbing steady and certain. But Samuel himself felt transformed, as if some heavy stone had been lifted from his chest. When he finally turned onto the rutted lane leading to his homestead, a strange calm settled over him. The house stood just as he'd left it, the porch sagging a bit more, the barn door creaking in the wind. The quiet here was absolute, broken only by the distant whicker of his old quarter horses and the soft shuffle of chickens in the yard. Samuel unpacked his bag slowly, moving through each familiar room with a sense of newness, as if seeing his life through different eyes. He settled back into routine, but nothing was as it had been. The morning chores took on a different rhythm, each movement deliberate, each task an act of memory and presence. Samuel cleaned stalls, fixed fences, mended tools, all the while letting his thoughts wander to Valor. He pictured the Mustang running beneath the open sky, mane tossing, scars slowly disappearing beneath new muscle and sunlight. The ache of loss remained, but it was gentle now, woven with pride and a strange, unexpected joy. Days slipped by, marked by the changing light and the restless wind. Samuel spent long hours riding the perimeter of his land, searching the horizon for movement he knew would never come. The old radio played softly on the porch in the evenings, the same country tunes Marian had loved, her memory drifting through the rooms like a gentle ghost. There were moments of loneliness, yes, a sudden pang at seeing an empty chair or the hush of twilight settling over the fields, but they were no longer sharp and unbearable. Instead, they felt like reminders that love, once given, never truly leaves. The neighbors noticed the change in him. Where before Samuel had kept to himself, eyes wary, voice quiet and clipped, now he nodded in greeting, offered a smile, even accepted the occasional invitation for coffee or supper. They didn't ask about the Mustang. Word had traveled fast through the county, and folks understood that some stories didn't need retelling. Instead, they spoke of weather, harvest, the slow return of wild herds to the hills. Samuel listened, shared what he could, and found comfort in the shared burdens and small kindnesses of rural life. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the air shimmered with the promise of rain, Samuel sat on his porch and watched a storm gather in the west. The sky turned bruise purple, streaked with lightning, and the wind carried the distant sound of thunder. He closed his eyes and imagined Valor out there somewhere, free, unbound, his spirit unbroken by rope or cruelty. In that moment, Samuel understood what Marian had always known, that love is not about possession or control, but about giving everything you have so another soul might find its own path. He thought of the day he'd found Valor, broken and wild at the edge of his land, of the nights spent nursing wounds, the small victories of trust and healing, of the fear and hope that had driven him to risk everything for a creature few would have thought worth saving. Samuel knew that, in saving Valor, he'd saved a part of himself, the part that still believed in goodness, in second chances, in the quiet heroism of doing what was right, even when no one was watching. Sometimes, when the wind shifted just right, Samuel fancied he could hear hoofbeats echoing across the plains, a wild song of freedom carried on the breeze. He would close his eyes and let that sound fill him with peace. There would be more lonely days, more storms to weather, more hard choices to make. But he faced them now with a steady heart, certain that compassion, like the land itself, endures through loss and change. As summer faded into fall and the nights grew cold, Samuel planted a patch of wildflowers at the edge of his property. He tended them each morning, imagining Marion's smile, remembering valor's strength. The flowers bloomed bright against the gray prairie, a living testament to the truth Samuel had learned, that true love means letting go, so that others might be free. He had given valor a second chance, and in doing so, had given himself the gift of hope, a hope that would outlast even the loneliest horizon. And so, beneath a Wyoming sky vast as forever, Samuel Carter carried on, not alone but changed, his grief softened by courage, his heart wide open to the wild, uncertain beauty of the world.